With the invention of the first durable metal, bronze, over 5,000 years ago, the experimentation with bladed weapons began. This new material allowed the size of knives and daggers, known since the Stone Age, to increase, giving rise to the first swords. Let's immediately address a popular online myth. Some writers claim that bronze couldn't have preceded iron because tin is very rare in nature, and they're mostly right about tin being rare. However, a good portion of ancient bronze was actually arsenical, meaning it was made without using tin at all. They also used quite common falur ores, which naturally contained both copper and arsenic. The melting point of pure copper and consequently bronze is noticeably lower than that of iron, so it could be smelted in simpler furnaces. However, the history of metallurgy is a vast topic in itself. Today we'll focus on the medieval single-handed and two-handed swords. It's important to note that the medieval European sword is a unified branch of evolution dating back to the 1st century AD. The Gallic spatha, which in the early Middle Ages evolved into the Carolingian sword, also known as the Viking sword, became the Romanesque knightly sword by the 11th century. Although researchers like Ewart Oakeshott classified swords into dozens of types, medieval weapon production wasn't standardized. While certain traditions in blade making existed at different times, every sword was somewhat unique. Typically, a classic medieval sword weighed up to 1.5 kilograms and was about a meter long. Many are surprised by the short grip, often less than 10 centimeters. This suggests that the sword owners weren't physically larger than modern people. On the other hand, it clearly indicates that these weapons were mostly used single-handedly. The Carolingian and later Romanesque swords were versatile in combat, effective for both mounted warriors and infantry. They were suitable for slashing and thrusting strikes. But it's important to understand that when it comes to hand forging, it's quite challenging to create a long strip of metal with a uniform strength structure. A sword is very demanding, both in terms of the quality of the metal and the skill of the blacksmith's hands. Because of this, for a long time it served not only as a weapon but also as a symbol of high status. However, its greatest relevance is tied to the early and initial centuries of the developed medieval period. During this time, the primary means of defense in warfare was chainmail, which typically didn't cover the entire body. By the 12th century, knights were fully covered in chainmail. From the 13th century onward, armor began to be reinforced with steel plates. While the sword remained part of the knight's arsenal, maces and axes became the secondary weapons after the spear. The improvement of armor led to the development of the bastard sword. Essentially, it was a longer sword with an extended grip, allowing for two-handed use. Such weapons were typically between 110 and 130 centimeters in length, weighing under 2 kilograms. Holding the weapon with both hands allowed for stronger slashing and thrusting attacks. It's worth mentioning that attempts to create a two-handed blade weapon were made as far back as the first millennium BC. However, since crafting a long and sturdy blade was quite a challenge, most of these efforts mainly focused on simply extending the length of the handle. In fact, while the longsword is designed to be used with either one or two hands, knights often had a one-handed weapon and a shield in addition to their spear. The bastard sword was often attached to the saddle and used in special cases. The enhancement of knightly armor in the 13th and 14th centuries not only led to the emergence of the bastard sword, but also influenced the infantry's shift toward heavy pole weapons. Halberds and pikes appeared on the battlefield. While the longsword became more accessible, its practical use declined. By the 15th century, advancements in metallurgy enabled the creation of full knightly plate armor and a new type of weapon, the two-handed sword. It's worth clarifying that a two-handed sword isn't simply any weapon that can be held with both hands. In theory, a longsword or even a gladius could be wielded this way. A true two-handed sword, however, cannot be effectively used single-handedly. The bastard sword, or even the popular katana, technically aren't true two-handers. Although classifications can be arbitrary, a proper two-handed sword is typically between 140 and 180 centimeters long, weighing between 2 and 3.5 kilograms. Wealthy individuals quickly realized that two-handed swords looked impressive and intimidating. Thus, in the late Middle Ages, there was a tradition of hiring personal guards armed with large ceremonial two-handers. Some of these ceremonial swords, weighing over 5 kilograms, weren't purely decorative and could be used in combat. A good example is Big Pierre, a sword over 2 meters long and weighing 6.5 kilograms. For comparison, an average crowbar is about 130 centimeters long and weighs around 5 kilograms. true battle-ready two-handed swords typically didn't exceed 3.5 kilograms. The unsharpened section near the hilt was used for blocking or special grips. Often additional protrusions formed a secondary guard, protecting the hand when gripping the blade in what's called half-swording. What were the pros and cons of this weapon? While many believe it was used only by the strongest warriors, that's debatable. Holding a 3-kilogram weapon with both hands isn't harder than wielding a 1-kilogram blade single-handedly. There's less strain on the wrist with a two-handed grip. Heavier, longer weapons allow for powerful strikes and greater reach, a significant advantage. Getting close to someone with a two-handed sword while using a shorter weapon is challenging. Parrying such strong strikes with a one-handed weapon or even a shield is difficult too. The idea that two-handed swords are slow weapons is largely a misconception pushed by video games, where developers need to maintain a certain balance. In reality, a two-handed sword was the perfect weapon for one-on-one duels, or even against a group of opponents. The wide, sweeping movements allowed the wielder to avoid being surrounded and inflicted devastating wounds on less protected foes. While it might not have been able to pierce good plate armor, using a half-sword grip, a skilled fighter could deliver quick thrusts to vulnerable areas like the armpits and other weak spots on an armored opponent. Moreover, the blows from a hefty blade to the limbs and sweeping strikes surely wouldn't go unnoticed. In the 15th and 16th centuries, two-handed swords were the weapons of feudal lords and wealthy mercenaries. For the nobility, it served as a means for individual duels, as well as a weapon for defense in case of being surrounded by a group of adversaries, both on the battlefield and in peacetime. Of course, this happened when a knight had to fight on foot. The situation with mercenaries was a bit more complicated. There's a belief that wielders of two-handed swords would chop down polearms on the battlefield. However, the owners of pikes and halberds weren't fools. They equipped their polearms with long steel langets to prevent them from breaking upon impact. More likely, the two-handed sword fighters would shift their opponent's polearm aside, creating a gap for a breakthrough. They also guarded flanks or protected high-ranking officers. 17th century theologian Sebastian Frank mentions Landsknechts, the Doppelsöldner, who fought with two-handed swords and received double pay. But again, it's hard to say with certainty whether they were getting paid for actually fighting on the front lines or for guarding high-ranking individuals. In dense battles, these swords were mainly used for quick thrusts. Bastard and two-handed swords were primarily dual weapons rather than battlefield tools. Thus, when fantasy writers arm their heroes with them, it's not entirely unrealistic. The main advantage of the one-handed sword was its use on horseback. It also allowed for tighter formations, crucial in battle. However, this was relevant until infantry switched to halberds and pikes. The two-handed sword was technologically superior, but medieval warriors rarely had to choose between the two. The emergence of the two-handed sword is linked to the late Middle Ages, a time when handheld firearms began their victorious march and feudalism was starting to crumble. So, having reached its peak of development in the 16th century, this formidable weapon quickly faded away. In its place came an army of the early modern period, typically lacking protective gear, replacing the feudal cavalry or heavy medieval infantry. This shift allowed lighter one-handed weapons to survive for a while longer, but they mostly took on a supporting role in warfare. Carrying a two-handed sword in everyday peaceful life as a means of defense was inconvenient, so it too faced oblivion here. Thus, the most technologically advanced and fearsome blade weapon lived a very short life and quickly faded into obscurity.